I watched a group of wealthy socialites humiliate my aunt on a luxury yacht, laughing as they called her a nobody who didn't belong. But when that Navy destroyer appeared on the horizon and every sailor on deck snapped to attention, saluting the woman they just mocked, their laughter died in their throats. What happened next would become the most talked about moment in San Diego's social scene for years to come. My name is Cameron, and the woman they destroyed with their words that night was my Aunt Cordelia. She's the person who saved my life when I was 12 years old, taking me in after my parents died in a horrific car accident on Interstate 5. For 16 years, she's been my anchor, my protector, and my biggest supporter. She raised me in her small coastal cottage in La Jolla, working what I always assumed was some boring government office job to pay for my college, my camera equipment, and every dream I ever had. Aunt Cordelia is 63 now, with silver hair. She keeps in a simple bun and kind brown eyes that crinkle when she smiles. She shops at Target, drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and has never owned anything more expensive than the small gold pendant she wears around her neck. She's quiet, thoughtful, and treats everyone from the grocery store clerk to the bank president with the same genuine respect. She taught me that character matters more than cash, that kindness costs nothing, and that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. What I didn't know, what nobody knew, was that my humble aunt, who clips coupons and grows her own vegetables, had once commanded the respect of thousands. The woman who taught me to tie my shoes and helped with my homework had secrets buried so deep that even I, the person closest to her in the world, had no idea who she really was. That night on the yacht, I learned that sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us wearing the most ordinary faces. And sometimes when you judge someone by their appearance instead of their character, the universe has a way of teaching you a lesson you'll never forget. I watched a group of wealthy socialites humiliate my aunt on a luxury yacht, laughing as they called her a nobody who didn't belong. But when that Navy destroyer appeared on the horizon, and every sailor on deck snapped to attention, saluting the woman they'd just mocked, their laughter died in their throats. What happened next would become the most talked about moment in San Diego's social scene for years to come. My name is Cameron, and the woman they destroyed with their words that night was my Aunt Cordelia. She's the person who saved my life when I was 12 years old, taking me in after my parents died in a horrific car accident on Interstate 5. For 16 years, she's been my anchor, my protector, and my biggest supporter. She raised me in her small coastal cottage in La Jolla, working what I always assumed was some boring government office job to pay for my college, my camera equipment, and every dream I ever had. Aunt Cordelia is 63 now. With silver hair she keeps in a simple bun and kind brown eyes that crinkle when she smiles. She shops at Target, drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and has never owned anything more expensive than the small gold pendant she wears around her neck. She's quiet, thoughtful, and treats everyone from the grocery store clerk to the bank president with the same genuine respect. She taught me that character matters more than cash, that kindness costs nothing, and that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. What I didn't know, what nobody knew, was that my humble aunt, who clips coupons and grows her own vegetables, had once commanded the respect of thousands. The woman who taught me to tie my shoes and helped with my homework had secrets buried so deep that even I, the person closest to her in the world, had no idea who she really was. That night on the yacht, I learned that sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us wearing the most ordinary faces. And sometimes when you judge someone by their appearance instead of their character, the universe has a way of teaching you a lesson you'll never forget. The story I'm about to tell you will change how you see every quiet person you meet, every modest stranger you encounter, and every assumption you make about who deserves your respect. Because my Aunt Cordelia taught me that real power doesn't need to announce itself, real strength doesn't need designer labels to prove its worth, and sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone else decides to ignore. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. The annual Veterans Relief Charity auction aboard the Golden Horizon. It read in elegant gold lettering. When I showed it to Aunt Cordelia, I expected her to politely decline like she did most social events. Instead, she stared at the invitation. For a long moment, her fingers tracing the words Veterans Relief with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We should go," she said quietly, surprising me completely. In all my years living with her, Aunt Cordelia had attended exactly 3 social events, and 2 of them were my high school graduation parties. She preferred quiet evenings at home, tending her garden or reading biographies of historical figures, especially military leaders. I always thought it was just intellectual curiosity. The yacht was a floating palace anchored in San Diego Bay, stretching nearly 200 feet with gleaming white surfaces and gold fixtures that caught the California sunset. As we approached in the water taxi, I could see elegantly dressed figures moving across multiple decks, their jewelry sparkling under string lights that probably cost more than my annual rent. Aunt Cordelia smoothed her simple navy dress, the same one she wore to church every Sunday. It was clean, pressed, and appropriate, but next to the designer gowns boarding ahead of us, it might as well have been a potato sack. She touched that gold pendant at her throat, a nervous habit I'd noticed since childhood but never questioned. "You look beautiful," I told her, and meant it. There was something timeless about her elegance, something that came from within rather than from a department store price tag. "Thank you, sweetheart," she replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I just want to support the veterans tonight. They deserve our help." The moment we stepped aboard, I knew we were in foreign territory. This wasn't just wealth, it was power. The kind of people who owned senators and judges, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives over cocktails and canapes. Harrison Blackwell greeted guests near the bar, his silver hair perfect and his smile practiced. His wife, Vivian, held court by the auction display, her diamond necklace catching light like a constellation around her throat. Thaddeus Morrison dominated conversations near the stern, his booming voice carrying stories about his latest tech acquisitions. Genevieve Ashford floated between groups like a social butterfly, her red hair perfectly styled and her emerald dress probably worth more than most people's cars. I watched Aunt Cordelia take it all in, her eyes moving carefully across the crowd. She wasn't intimidated exactly, but she was studying them the way she studied everything, quiet and analytical. We found seats at a corner table where she could observe the auction items, most of which honored different branches of military service. When the bidding began, Aunt Cordelia participated modestly, winning a few smaller items like a vintage military photograph and a memorial flag. Each time her paddle went up, I noticed her posture change slightly, becoming more straight-backed, more decisive, but she kept her bids reasonable, never competing with the big spenders who threw around thousands like pocket change. "Are you enjoying yourself?" I asked during a break between auction lots. She smiled, but there was something distant in her expression. "It brings back memories," she said simply. "Good ones, mostly." I wanted to ask what memories, but something in her tone warned me off. Aunt Cordelia had always been private about her past before I came to live with her. I knew she'd worked for the government in some capacity, knew she'd never married or had children of her own, knew she'd traveled extensively when she was younger. But the details were always vague, brushed aside whenever I asked directly. Looking back now, I realized there were signs I missed. The way she always stood perfectly straight, the precise way she organized everything in her home, the military biographies that filled her bookshelves, and most telling of all, the genuine reverence in her voice whenever she spoke about service, members, and veterans. As the evening progressed and the alcohol flowed more freely among the other guests, I noticed their attention beginning to focus on our quiet corner table. Aunt Cordelia seemed oblivious, studying the auction catalog with genuine interest, but I could feel the weight of their stares and whispered comments beginning to build. The first attack came disguised as politeness. Vivian Blackwell glided over to our table during a break in the auction, her diamond bracelet catching the string lights as she extended a perfectly manicured hand. Her smile was razor-sharp beneath layers of expensive makeup. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they're about to destroy someone. "I'm Vivian Blackwell. This is my husband's yacht." She paused, letting the ownership sink in. And you are? Aunt Cordelia stood gracefully, extending her own hand with genuine warmth. Cordelia Mackenzie, thank you so much for hosting such a wonderful event for our veterans. Vivian's smile faltered for just a moment at the word our, but recovered quickly. Mackenzie, how lovely. And what brings you to our little gathering? Are you perhaps someone's guest? A caregiver, maybe? The insult was wrapped in silk, but it was still an insult. I started to stand, but Aunt Cordelia's gentle touch on my shoulder kept me seated. She'd been handling bullies longer than I'd been alive. I'm here to support the cause, Aunt Cordelia replied calmly. Veterans' welfare has always been important to me. How admirable, Vivian purred, though her eyes had gone cold. And what exactly do you do, dear? For work, I mean. I'm retired. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Genevieve Ashford materialized beside Vivian as if summoned by the scent of social blood in the water. Her red hair was swept into an elaborate updo that probably required a team of stylists, and her emerald dress cost more than most people's monthly salary. Retired from what exactly? Genevieve asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The local diner? Or perhaps you were a secretary somewhere? Their laughter was musical and vicious. Other guests began turning toward our table, drawn by the commotion like sharks sensing wounded prey. I felt my face burning with anger, but Aunt Cordelia remained perfectly composed. I worked in operations management, she said simply. Operations management, Thaddeus Morrison boomed as he joined the growing circle around our table. His face was flushed from champagne, and his eyes held the cruel gleam of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. How wonderfully vague. Let me guess, you managed operations at the post office? Or maybe a small-town government building? The crowd around us was growing larger. Harrison Blackwell appeared with a fresh drink, clearly enjoying the entertainment. His wife was providing. Other wealthy guests pressed closer, their conversations dying as they sensed drama unfolding. Tell us, Cordelia, Vivian continued, her voice rising slightly so more people could hear. What kind of operations did you manage? I'm simply dying to know what qualifies someone for an event like this. Aunt Cordelia's hand moved to her pendant, her fingers closing around it briefly. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, something that looked almost like pity for the people surrounding us. I managed people, she said quietly, and resources, during some difficult times. People and resources, Thaddeus repeated mockingly. How impressively bureaucratic. I manage people too, dear. I run a tech company worth $3 billion. I employ 14,000 people across 6 countries. He gestured expansively at the yacht around us. This is what real management looks like. The cruelty was escalating now, feeding on itself as the wealthy crowd found a common target. Genevieve stepped closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried across the entire deck. Harrison, darling, I think there's been some mistake with the guest list. This woman clearly doesn't understand the caliber of people who attend these events. Perhaps security should verify she's supposed to be here. The suggestion hit like a physical blow. Every conversation on the yacht stopped. Servers paused with their trays. Even the string quartet seemed to play more quietly. All eyes were on our table now, watching to see how the obvious outsider would respond to being publicly questioned about her right to exist in their world. I watched my aunt's face carefully, looking for signs that she was about to break. Her eyes had grown distant, and she was very still in that way she got when she was thinking deeply about something. The pendant at her throat caught the light, and for the first time, I really looked at it. It wasn't just a simple gold charm like I'd always assumed. There were details etched into the metal, symbols I couldn't quite make out in the dim lighting. I think, Vivian continued, her confidence growing with the crowd's attention, that perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a different sort of event. Something more suited to your background. The words were chosen carefully, designed to wound, without being overtly offensive. It was death by 1,000 cuts, the kind of social assassination that wealthy people had perfected into an art form. Aunt Cordelia stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. I expected her to excuse herself, to retreat with dignity, intact but spirit crushed. Instead, she looked directly at Vivian Blackwell with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or hurt or embarrassment. It was something much more dangerous. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I probably don't belong here." She reached for her small purse, and I thought that was it. We were leaving. The bullies had won, and my kind, gentle aunt was going to carry this humiliation home with her. But as she stood there, something began to change in the air around us. The other guests sensed it too, their cruel smiles wavering slightly as they looked at her face. "Some of us," Aunt Cordelia continued, her voice growing stronger, "know what it really means to serve others." It was a Navy destroyer, and it was heading straight for the Golden Horizon. The destroyer was still just a gray speck on the horizon when Harrison Blackwell noticed it first. He squinted into the distance, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. "That's odd," he muttered. "There shouldn't be any military vessels in this area tonight." But Aunt Cordelia had seen it too, and something extraordinary happened to her face. The uncertain, nervous expression she'd worn all evening vanished, replaced by something I'd never witnessed before. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and suddenly she looked like she was standing on the bridge of that approaching ship rather than cowering under the attacks of petty socialites. "Perhaps we should head inside," Vivian suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the military presence interrupting her perfect evening. "The auction continues in the main salon." "No," Aunt Cordelia said firmly, and there was steel in her voice that made everyone stop moving. "I think I'll stay right here." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The woman who'd been apologetically occupying space at their table was gone. In her place stood someone who looked like she belonged exactly where she was, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. She moved to the yacht's railing, her hands gripping the polished wood with familiarity, as if she'd spent countless hours on ship decks before. "Cordelia," I said quietly, joining her at the rail. "Are you okay?" She turned to me with a smile that was entirely different from any I'd seen before. It wasn't the gentle grandmother smile I knew. This smile belonged to someone who'd made life and death decisions. Someone who'd earned the right to stand anywhere she chose. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart," she said, and her voice carried a confidence that made my chest tighten with sudden emotion. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Behind us, the socialites were regrouping for another attack. I could hear Vivian's voice rising with fresh venom. "How convenient that a military ship appears just as we're discussing whether certain people belong at events like this. Perhaps they're here to collect their wayward guests." Genevieve's laughter was sharp and cutting. "Oh, how perfect. A Coast Guard rescue for the woman who thinks she belongs with her betters." But Thaddeus Morrison's voice carried the cruelest blow. "Maybe they're here to escort her back to whatever retirement home she escaped from. This is what happens when security doesn't properly screen the guest list." The laughter that followed was ugly and mean-spirited, designed to drive my aunt away in shame. I spun around, ready to unleash 16 years of protective fury on these monsters, but Aunt Cordelia caught my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Watch," she said simply. The destroyer was close enough now that we could see individual figures moving on its deck. It was massive, bristling with equipment and flying the American flag proudly from its stern. As it approached, something began happening that made everyone on the yacht fall silent. Sailors were emerging from below, decks taking positions along the destroyer's rail. They moved with perfect precision, their white uniforms crisp even in the evening light. One by one, they came to attention, their eyes fixed not on the yacht itself, but on something specific. Aunt Cordelia stepped forward slightly, her hand moving from the pendant at her throat to rest against her heart. The gesture was automatic, practiced, like muscle memory from a lifetime of military protocol. "What's happening?" Harrison Blackwell demanded, his voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. "Why are they lined up like that?" But I was watching my aunt's face, and I saw something there that made my breath catch. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd been expecting it. The pendant at her throat wasn't just jewelry, I realized. Suddenly, it was identification, a signal, a key to a world I'd never imagined she belonged to. The destroyer's horn sounded once, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the yacht's hull and into our bones. On the destroyer's deck, every sailor had now come to perfect attention, their faces serious and respectful as they waited for something. Behind us, the wealthy guests had fallen into confused silence. Their cruel laughter had died completely, replaced by nervous whispers and uncertain glances. They could sense that something significant was happening, something beyond their understanding or control. Aunt Cordelia stood straighter than I'd ever seen her, her simple navy dress suddenly looking less like humble clothing and more like a uniform. The woman who'd let them mock her without fighting back was preparing for something, and whatever it was going to change everything. "Cordelia," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the destroyer's engines growing closer. "Who are you?" She turned to me with eyes that held depths I'd never noticed before, depths that spoke of command decisions and heavy responsibilities and secrets carried for decades. My aunt, my quiet, humble Aunt Cordelia, stood at the yacht's railing and returned their salute with the natural grace of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. In that moment, she wasn't the woman who'd raised me in a modest cottage. She was Admiral Cordelia Mackenzie, and she was magnificent. The salute held for exactly 15 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. When the sailors finally returned to their normal positions, the silence on the golden horizon was so complete you could hear the water lapping against the hull. Every single person on that yacht was staring at my aunt with expressions ranging from shock to horror to something approaching terror. Harrison Blackwell was the first to move, stumbling forward with his face flushed red from embarrassment and alcohol. "Admiral Mackenzie, I had no idea. Please, if I had known who you were, I never would have allowed—" His voice trailed off as he realized there was no good way to finish that sentence. "Allowed what, Mr. Blackwell?" Aunt Cordelia asked, her voice gentle but carrying an edge that made him step back. "Allowed your guests to mock someone they perceived as beneath them, or allowed someone you thought was unworthy to attend your charity event for veterans?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, because that was exactly what he'd allowed, and now everyone knew it. Vivian Blackwell approached next, her earlier cruelty replaced by frantic damage control. "Admiral, please accept my sincere apologies. I was just making conversation. I never meant to imply that you didn't belong here. Obviously, someone of your stature belongs anywhere she chooses to be. But you did imply it," I said, my voice shaking with anger I could no longer contain. "You questioned her right to be here. You suggested security should remove her. You made her feel unwelcome at an event honoring the very people she served with." Genevieve Ashford looked like she wanted to disappear into the yacht's expensive deckboards. Her emerald dress, which had seemed so elegant an hour ago, now looked gaudy and desperate. "Admiral Mackenzie, I sincerely apologize. I was completely out of line. If there's anything I can do to make amends—" "There is," Aunt Cordelia said calmly. "You can remember this feeling the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations. You can ask yourself whether the person you're about to dismiss might have a story worth knowing." Thaddeus Morrison, who'd boasted about managing 14,000 employees, could barely meet her eyes. "Admiral, I manage a large company, but what you've accomplished, commanding the Pacific Fleet, I can't even imagine the responsibility." "The responsibility," Aunt Cordelia replied, "wasn't in commanding ships or personnel, Mr. Morrison. It was in bringing every single person under my command home safely to their families. That's what real management looks like." Captain Rodriguez had been standing quietly nearby, allowing the yacht's guests to process their humiliation. Now he stepped forward with obvious pride. "If I may, Admiral, the crew would be honored to provide escort to wherever you'd like to go this evening." The offer was both generous and pointed. Here was a decorated military officer offering my aunt transportation that was infinitely more honorable than remaining among people who'd treated her so poorly. But Aunt Cordelia surprised everyone, including me. "Thank you, Captain, but I think we'll stay for the rest of the auction. These veterans' charities need support, and that's why we came." Her decision to remain was the final masterstroke. She wasn't running away or making a dramatic exit. She was staying because the cause mattered more than her pride, more than their embarrassment, more than the social politics that had just exploded around us. As Captain Rodriguez prepared to return to his ship, he paused beside our table. "Admiral, if you don't mind me saying, it's good to see you again. The fleet still talks about Operation Neptune's Shield. What you accomplished out there saved a lot of lives." "We all did our jobs, Captain," she replied. "That's what service means." After the destroyers departed, continuing their training exercises, the yacht felt different. The auction resumed, but the energy had completely changed. People approached our table throughout the evening, not to mock or question, but to quietly apologize and express genuine interest in my aunt's service. Harrison Blackwell personally delivered a written apology and donated an additional $50,000 to the Veterans Charity in Admiral Mackenzie's name. Vivian spent the rest of the evening in what could only be described as mortified silence, her earlier social confidence completely shattered. During the drive home in our modest Honda Civic, I finally asked the questions that had been burning inside me for hours. "Why didn't you ever tell me? All these years, I thought you worked in some government office pushing papers." Aunt Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, her hands steady on the steering wheel. "Because being an admiral was what I did, Cameron. Being your aunt is who I am. The Navy was my career, but raising you has been my calling. But the respect, the recognition, the honor you deserved. I had all the recognition I needed," she said simply. "I had the respect of the people who served with me, and I had the love of the nephew who became my whole world. What more could anyone want?" That night taught me something profound about real strength and genuine class. It's not about the size of your bank account or the designer label on your dress. It's about how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching. It's about carrying your achievements with humility and using your power to lift others up rather than tear them down. 6 months later, the annual Veterans Relief Charity Auction had a new location and a new host. Admiral Cordelia Mackenzie, despite her protests about preferring quiet evenings at home, had been unanimously elected to chair the event. Under her leadership, the charity raised 3 times more money than ever before, and not a single guest was ever made to feel unwelcome, regardless of their background or bank balance. But the real change happened in how I see the world now. Every time I meet someone new, I remember that night on the yacht. I remember that the elderly woman in line at the grocery store might be a retired surgeon who saved hundreds of lives. The quiet man at the coffee shop might be a former teacher who inspired thousands of students. The modest woman at the bus stop might have once commanded fleets and changed the course of history. My Aunt Cordelia taught me that extraordinary people don't announce themselves with fanfare and expensive clothes. They announce themselves through kindness, through service, and through the quiet dignity of treating everyone they meet as worthy of respect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the universe gives you a front row seat to watch bullies learn that lesson the hard way. The pendant she wears isn't just jewelry.
It's a reminder that real strength comes from within. Real honor is earned through service to others, and real class has nothing to do with the price tag on your dress and everything to do with the content of your character. If this story touched
your heart or changed how you think about the people you meet every day, I'd love for you to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone being unfairly judged based on their appearance? Or maybe you've discovered that someone you knew had an incredible hidden past. I read every comment, and your stories inspire the content I create. And if you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength and unexpected justice, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. I share new stories every week about ordinary people with extraordinary secrets, moments when the underdog gets their day, and times when the universe delivers perfect justice to those who deserve it most. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The destroyer pulled alongside the golden horizon with the precision of a military operation, its massive hull dwarfing the luxury yacht. The engine noise dropped to a low rumble, and in the sudden quiet, we could hear the crisp commands being shouted across the destroyer's deck. Then, as if choreographed by an invisible conductor, something breathtaking happened. Every sailor visible on the destroyer snapped to perfect attention. Not the casual acknowledgement you might give a passing boat, but the rigid, respectful posture of military personnel recognizing superior authority. Their eyes weren't focused on the yacht's wealth or its famous owner. They were looking directly at my aunt. "What the hell is going on?" Harrison Blackwell demanded, his voice cracking with confusion and growing panic. Before anyone could answer, the destroyer's loudspeaker crackled to life. The voice that emerged was crisp, professional, and unmistakably respectful. "Admiral Mackenzie, this is Captain Rodriguez of the USS Defender. Permission to come aboard and provide escort, ma'am." "Admiral." The word hit the yacht like a physical force. Vivian Blackwell's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the polished deck in a spray of crystal and expensive wine. Genevieve Ashford's mouth fell open, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale face. Thaddeus Morrison actually staggered backward, bumping into a server who barely managed to keep his tray of canapes from crashing to the ground. But it was Harrison Blackwell's reaction that I'll remember forever. The man who owned this floating palace, who'd been treating my aunt like an unwelcome intruder, went white as his pristine yacht deck. His hands were shaking so badly he had to set down his drink. "Admiral?" he whispered, the word barely audible. My aunt, my humble Aunt Cordelia, who drove a Honda Civic and shopped with grocery store coupons, stepped forward to the yacht's edge with the bearing of someone born to command. The nervous, apologetic woman from dinner was completely gone. In her place stood a leader who radiated authority from every pore. "Permission granted, Captain," she called back, her voice carrying across the water with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. A launch detached from the destroyer, cutting through the darkening water toward us. As it approached, I could see the young captain at its helm, his uniform perfectly pressed, his expression one of deep respect and barely contained excitement. When Captain Rodriguez stepped aboard the Golden Horizon, he moved with the fluid precision of a career military officer. He was probably in his early 40s, with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent at sea. But when he saw my aunt, his entire demeanor shifted to something approaching. "Reverence, Admiral Mackenzie," he said, rendering a salute so crisp it could have been used in a training manual. "It's an honor to see you again, ma'am. The crew was thrilled when we spotted the Golden Horizon on our route and recognized your transponder." "Signal. Transponder signal." My mind reeled. My aunt had some kind of military tracking device. "Thank you, Captain," Aunt Cordelia replied, returning his salute with movements so natural they had to be instinctive. "Though I'm retired now. You don't need to maintain such formality." Captain Rodriguez's face broke into a grin that transformed his stern features. "With respect, ma'am, once an admiral, always an admiral, especially one who commanded the Pacific Fleet's largest operation in 30 years. The silence on the yacht was deafening. Pacific Fleet, largest operation. The words hung in the air like accusations against every person who'd mocked her that evening. "Admiral Mackenzie," the captain continued, his voice rising slightly so the entire yacht could hear, "commanded Task Force 7 during Operation Neptune's Shield. She coordinated 17 ships and over 8,000 personnel in the most complex naval operation since World War II. He looked directly at the stunned socialites. She's also a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient and the first woman to achieve 4-star rank through combat operations rather than administrative advancement. 4 stars, Congressional Medal of Honor, combat operations. Each revelation hit the yacht's guests like physical blows. These weren't just impressive credentials, they were legendary achievements that most military personnel only dreamed of. Vivian Blackwell looked like she might faint. The woman who'd questioned my aunt's right to attend a charity event had just learned she'd been insulting one of the most decorated military leaders in American history. The destroyers USS Defender and USS Guardian were conducting training. "Exercises in the area," Captain Rodriguez explained, gesturing toward the horizon where another gray shape was now visible. "When we received your location ping, the entire crew requested permission to pay their respects." Location ping. My aunt wasn't just wearing jewelry, she was wearing some kind of military beacon that identified her to Navy vessels. The implications crashed over me like a wave. "That won't be necessary, Captain," Aunt Cordelia said gently, though I appreciate the gesture. Actually, ma'am, if you'll permit me, Captain Rodriguez said, pulling out a small communications device. The crew of the Guardian specifically requested to participate. He spoke briefly into the radio, and within moments, the second destroyer's horn sounded across the water. Both ships were now positioned on either side of the golden horizon, their crews lined up along the rails in perfect formation. Admiral Mackenzie, Captain Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across all three vessels through the destroyer's loudspeaker system. By order of the Pacific Fleet Command, and in recognition of your distinguished service to the United States Navy and the American people, we render honors. What happened next will be burned into my memory forever. Over 400 sailors across both destroyers came to simultaneous attention and rendered the most perfect synchronized salute I've ever witnessed. The sound of their movements was like a single sharp crack across the water. My aunt, my quiet, humble Aunt Cordelia, stood at the yacht's railing and returned their salute with the natural grace of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. In that moment, she wasn't the woman who'd raised me in a modest cottage. She was Admiral Cordelia Mackenzie, and she was magnificent.